Before I begin, I'd like to thank you all for inviting us here. We're glad to be here. It's always a pleasure to come here and visit with acquaintances and meet new people. I think an awful lot of the man who preaches here, Darren Chapel. He's a fine preacher and a good man. I'm glad you all have that benefit here. I feel the pressure now. I wish we could have attended the past two nights. It's kind of a busy time for us, as I'm sure it is for you. But I know that the subject was discussed thoroughly. I'm always afraid that I'm going to duplicate material or make an attempt at stealing someone else's thunder, and I don't want to steal any of Kevin's thunder for tomorrow night. So we will begin tonight with the statement here. This has been a very interesting study for me, one that I've done before, but it's always amazing the abundance of material here on the subject of faith. Mentioned over 200 times in the New Testament, just the word faith alone, and that doesn't include its verb form, believe. I didn't even look to see how many times it's used. So it's a little overwhelming, and I have to know what to put in and what to cut out, and it's a hard job because, no matter what's said about faith tonight, we need to understand that as people who seek to be near to God, this is a concept that we must master. And so I would hope and pray that at the end of this discourse tonight that you would not only think about what's been said, but go back and open your Bibles and study this concept, this word faith. Learn about it because it is an absolute must. In our text tonight, we find that what I've been assigned to speak of is contained within the final exhortation. There are several exhortations given here, a series. In chapter 5 and verse 21, there's an exhortation to conduct ourselves as Christians. In 5:22 through 33, there is a discussion of the relationship between husbands and wives. In 6:1 through 4, the relationship of parents to children. And 6:5 through 9, slaves and masters. And finally, we are here at our text tonight. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 10. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Warfare. It's a serious, serious thing. Something that ordinarily we would dread. And I know that everyone here has experienced warfare in some way or another. I don't know that a generation has ever lived in this country that hasn't experienced warfare in some way. There's one going on everywhere. All you've got to do is turn on the television. It's a serious, serious thing. This warfare is a little bit different than that. This is a battle that we must fight and we must win. There's just no doubt about it. To fall, and I don't know of an exception to this in the New Testament, anytime that word is used, it refers to failure. When we fall, we succumb to the enemy, and this cannot happen. This cannot happen in this type of warfare. Now, there are particulars given. First of all, we have in our text the requirement for this battle. And that is the whole armor of God, verse 11. And again in verse 15, take up the whole armor of God. Now in the original, the whole armor is one word. And we've heard this word before. I think there's a hymn that we sing sometimes that contains this word, the panoply. The panoply of God. It's not just a bit or a piece. It is the whole thing. And we must clothe ourselves with every single piece of armor that's mentioned here. The reason for the battle. And we look again at our text. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood. Look at verse 11 though first. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. This is the reason for the battle. And the word means to stand up, to stand forth. The schemes. The word scheme means just regular activity, just a schedule of events. It's expected of the devil. We expect this of him. We don't expect anything good out of him, do we? Not ever. We expect him to be at odds with us at all times. And we use for an example of that what we find in the book of Job, where the devil was constantly, he's obsessed. It's not just a thing that he does, he's obsessed with it, because God said, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And I've often wondered how many other people the devil could have presented before God and said, "Look at all of my servants." You know, if we consider how it is today, how many servants of God are there in comparison to servants of the devil? I think we'd be a little off there. The odds might be a little off, but the devil disregarded all of these other people that may very well have been servants of his and focused on Job because he's obsessed. He has to lead Job astray, just like he is obsessed with leading us astray. You know, the devil said to God, you've built a hedge around him. You've blessed him in every way. You take all of that away and he'll curse you to your face. That's what he wants us to do. He wants us to curse God to his face. That's the reason for the battle. In verse, you know, that's not all of it though, really, come to think of it. He says to stand, he says to withstand. To withstand. Sometimes we hear this warfare pictured as a defensive warfare, where we stand up and we hide behind the shield and we just hope that nothing knocks us down. No, that's not what it is at all, because we are to stand against, we are to oppose evil. That's why we're in this battle. You know, I wish that we could all, we talk about love a lot, and it's good. We need to talk about love probably more than we do. But this is a battle, and there is opposition. There are enemies out there, and we've got to stand forward, stand up, stand forward, and oppose the enemy. Now, look at verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So, the nature of the battle is spiritual. This is not like the warfare that I was talking about at the beginning. And when we say spiritual, sometimes we get this idea that this is some mystical skirmish. No, not at all. This is reality. The spiritual is not mystical and just out there somewhere on a cloud. It's reality. It's the most important battle that we'll fight. It's infinitely more important than any other battle that we'll fight. Now, preparation for the battle. And here we have the elements of the armor of God, the panoply. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. Now, my translation says there, in all circumstances. Some translations say above all. I believe the King James Version uses that. Some translations use the word with all. That would be the American Standard Version, the Revised Standard. The word with all simply means in addition to. In addition to all. The New American Standard Version renders it in addition to. And the latter there would better fit the context, because we're talking about putting on the whole armor of God, not just bits and pieces. So, in addition to everything else that's been talked about here, we need to take up the shield of faith. Now, we need it all. The shield. Now, this is not a shield like you see on television. It's not a shield like we buy replicas of for Halloween and that kind of thing, that you hold up and you see people fighting them, actually using them as of offense and all of that. This is not that kind of a shield. This word refers to a big four-cornered shield. The word actually is a derivative that we would translate door. So it looks like a door. It is made to withstand a full frontal attack. We can stand behind this thing. And I think it's important that we get that idea. We must oppose evil. We cannot let it pass by us. You know, we talk, well, what about from the flank? Well, we're worried about the forefront here. We're worried about opposing the evil, keeping it from passing us by. And in order to quench these flaming darts. Now, darts are also, that word can also be translated missile or javelin or arrow. Over there in 2 Samuel 18, these are the weapons that Joab used to pierce the heart of Absalom as he hung by his hair in that tree. So they were deadly weapons. They were full well capable of putting people to death. And on top of that, they're on fire. They're set on fire. We don't want to be hit by one of these things. In fact, the matter is, they can be fatal. They can also be extremely incapacitating if you're touched anywhere with one of these things. So we must not be touched by these flaming darts. This shield, this four-cornered shield, is our protection, to stand behind, to protect us, to quench these darts. Faith, then, is actually our protector. Now, faith defined, and I'll bet you know where we're going to go. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time defining faith, because I would bet that everybody within the sound of my voice has heard it defined many times before. I'll bet everybody in here knows exactly what faith is. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And if you skip down to verse 6, and there, and without faith it is impossible to please Him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him. First of all, assurance. Assurance of things hoped for. Now this could, in my mind, refer to absolutely to these promises that's referred to in verse 6. We are assured, we know that we will receive the promises, the rewards that God has promised us. The final, ultimate, heavenly home. You know, He promises us things here on this earth as well. There are all kinds of blessings in the Bible that we can take advantage of right now. And we'll talk real briefly about some of those in just a little bit. But He promises us these things, these blessings, here while we're on this earth, and the ultimate, final, heavenly reward, the home where we will go and spend eternity, where we will finally lay our armor down. There is no doubting. No doubting. Then he says conviction. Conviction of things not seen. And then there's an illustration given here in this text. The things that are created, the things that we see here, have been created from materials that we cannot see. Things that are not seen. That's the illustration given in this text. We also examined in the previous text the spiritual forces that we are at battle with. We do not see them either. We believe, we know that God exists, a being that we cannot see. We are convicted to that God. This is total commitment. So we have no doubting, we have total commitment, and there is one great acknowledgement that must be by humanity in order to draw near to God. Now, Jeremiah we call him the weeping prophet, and he was begging and pleading with these people to return to God. And he made several observations in his writings, and in chapter 10 and 23, He said, "For I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself, and it is not within man who walks to guide his steps." Now Solomon makes an observation, one in Proverbs 14 and verse 12, and again in Proverbs 16 and verse 25. The exact same thing he says twice. And he says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but that is the way that leads to death. So what do? Well, Jeremiah, once again, he's exhorting these people, and he says, stop in the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is. Walk in it and receive rest for your soul. So Jeremiah says, we don't know the way. It's not in there. Well, we can go our own way, sure, but he's talking about the right way here. The right way comes not from within us, it comes from somewhere else. Jeremiah says, you've got to stop and look and ask, find out. Ask where that ancient path is. Ask where that good way is, the right way. It is not from within. We do not go our own way and call it God. You know, there are people that do that all the time. They decide what they're going to do. They decide how they're going to live. And they bring God from within themselves. Well, surely God will be pleased with this. No, because God does not come from within us. We are to seek Him. That's what Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, and that's how that instructs us. We seek Him. God does not originate within us. We draw near to Him. This is total submission. Total submission. So faith, we have total confidence. There's no doubting. We have total commitment to God and total submission to God. There's our definition. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 6, we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what man can do to me. If we're totally confident, totally committed, and totally submissive to God and no one else. God, through faith, is our great protector. So as we condense this, you see, I'm trying my dead level best to condense this material. You want to talk about faith, there are so many different ways used in the Bible. You know, there's that great system of faith. And that's everything. And Jesus, who is the great acknowledger of faith, talks about people of little faith. He talks about people of great faith. God talks about the breaking of faith or the breach of faith in the Old Testament. But I want to focus now on the great mark of our faith, as we think of it as our protector in our context. The great mark of faith, in my mind, can be condensed into one word, and that is obedience. Obedience. Now, failure in this regard, of course, is devastating, but in the Old Testament, God considered failure in obedience as a breach of faith or broken faith. Now, for an illustration of that, turn with me to 1 Chronicles chapter 10 and verse 13. 1 Chronicles chapter 10 and verse 13. So Saul, who was the first king of Israel, died for his breach of faith. Now let's examine what that breach of faith is. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. So here's Saul, who's the king of Israel, and obviously God has expectations for him. They don't differ a whole lot, though, from the expectations that he had for everyone else at that time. He gave commands. He expected to be obeyed. Saul refused to obey, and God considered that a breach of faith, and He paid for that with His life. Now look back one chapter, 1 Chronicles chapter 9 and verse 1. 1 Chronicles chapter 9 and verse 1. So all Israel was recorded in genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was taken into exile into Babylon because of their breach of faith. And once again, the breach of faith is their disobedience. God tested Israel many times. Now, some people don't want to believe that God tests us, but He does. He tests us each time to see if they would obey. God's intention, obviously, for these people to obey Him. He tested them in Exodus chapter 15 at the bitter waters of Marah. Now, they had just crossed the sea. Can you imagine the sight? The sea parting and walking across right through the middle of the Dead Sea on dry ground with the billows of water on either. I imagine that. Sometimes I have nightmares about such as that. You know, what if that comes down? We'll talk about that a little bit later too, by the way. Did that, and they'd seen that. And they also saw that water come crashing down on top of the armies of the Egyptians and wipe them out. And so they arrived at Marah and they drank the water and they were bitter. You know, when I was in school, I was on the dairy products judging team in ag. And we had to taste sour milk and bad cheese and all that kind of thing. And after you taste 2 or 3 samples of that, you kind of want to wash your mouth out. And so we used to go every year to El Dorado Springs. You ever been to El Dorado Springs? And I hope I don't offend anybody. I don't want to offend anybody from El Dorado Springs, but that water is terrible. And I decided, you know, I think I'd just rather keep the old sour milk taste in my mouth as taste that water. And these people, they came to this, and I would imagine that the water did taste pretty bad. And so they began to complain about it, and so God gave Moses some instructions. Moses followed the instructions, and the waters were made sweet so that they could be consumed. And in verse 26 of chapter 15, God says, "If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in His eyes, and give ear to His commandments, and keep all His statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." Now that was the test that God gave them. He purified the waters of Marah, and He said, if you'll obey me, I'll take care of you from now on. I'll see to it that you've always got good water to drink. I'll see to it that you always have your health. And I've often wondered, what if they had passed the test? Now there were times when they obeyed, and we see that every time they obeyed, they were blessed because of it. Every time. God is completely and totally trusted. But we know that ultimately they failed that test. And a little later on, after their refusal, you know, they came into the land of Canaan. God had this expectation, this command. He said, I want you to drive out all of the inhabitants of the land. Now, folks, that isn't rocket science. They understood every word He said. Drive them out. I don't want them in here. And He told them why. Even though He wasn't obligated to, He told them why. Because they would be a snare and a temptation to them. Well, they refused. They refused to drive out all of the Canaanites. And so in Judges chapter 3 and verse 4, God decides, well, I'm not going to drive them all. I'm not going to drive them out. Now, God could have driven them out Himself without their help. He didn't need their help. But they refused to do it. God says, I'm not going to drive them out. In verse 4 of Judges 3, they were for the testing of Israel. God left these Canaanites in the land for the testing of Israel. And guess what the test is? To know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which He commanded them by the hand of Moses. So the test was, you didn't run them out like I told you to. I'm going to leave them here, and I'm going to see. I'm going to see if you're going to obey me. Now God was willing even yet to give these people the opportunity to obey. Obey me, and I'll protect you. He says it over and over again. If you'll obey me, even though these Canaanites are there, even though it's your fault that they're there, if you'll obey me, I'll protect you from them. But they miserably failed that test, and as we've already seen, destroyed because of their lack of obedience, their breach of faith. They refused the protection that God offered them. You know, we referred to an exhortation that Jeremiah made to Israel during that time. And he says, you know, stop in the roads and look and ask for the ancient path where the good way is. Walk in it and receive rest for your souls. And you know what their answer was? You can probably look and see. They said, we will not walk in it. And they were good to their word. They didn't walk in it. They were destroyed because of it. Now in contrast, here we have who Paul refers to in Galatians 3 as Abraham, the man of faith. The personification of faith. God tested Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, and we all know what that test was. An amazing thing. Something that I have a hard time grasping. This test that God gave Abraham. Called upon Abraham to sacrifice his son, the one through whom the offspring would be named, we're told. Isaac. To offer him up as a sacrifice on an altar. And Abraham, we find, getting up early in the morning. You know, kind of like I do to go to work. Just like God said to do it, not only am I going to do it, but I'm going to get up early in the morning and go do it. It's an amazing thing. And we find in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 19, where this is discussed, that Abraham believed that God would raise him from the dead. That is an amazing display of faith. No wonder Paul refers to Abraham as the man of faith. Total confidence in God. God told him, your son Isaac will be your heir. He will be the offspring. He will be the one through whom the offspring will be named. That's him. I want you to go and put him to death on an altar. Abraham didn't understand that, but he said, God's going to raise him from the dead. Total confidence, total commitment to God, and total submission. I'll tell you what, you put yourself in his place, especially all of you who have children. I've got 2 of my own. And if I were told to take one of my children and go and sacrifice him on an altar, I don't know that I'd get up early in the morning. I don't know. We need to think about that because this is our example. This is the display that we have. This is what a human being is capable of, and this, folks, is what God desires. This is what He desires. Now, let's test our faith. Let's have a little test and see how we do. Now, I've already taken this test, and I know how I do. But indulge me. Now, we're going to use the teachings of Jesus here. Jesus, the great acknowledger of faith. First of all, we'll look to Matthew chapter 6, and we will begin reading from verse 25. Matthew chapter 6, beginning with verse 25. Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his lifespan? And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, not much more clothe you. Now notice, O you of little faith. Therefore do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Therefore do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Now, plainly, God promised to provide our physical needs if we will seek His kingdom and His righteousness. He says all of these things will be added, and that word added is an interesting word. It actually means to get something, how we would say it in this part of the country, I guess, we get something to boot. We get something thrown in. Matthew Henry's commentary says in illustration, he who buys the goods has the paper and twine flung in. Of course, we don't use paper and twine anymore, but back then they tied things up with paper and twine, and that was you got that for free. You got that added, and that's the idea here. So God, if we seek His kingdom and His righteousness, is going to throw in our physical needs. He's going to take care of us. Anxiety over these things is demonstrative of little faith. Folks, this is the plague of my life. It is the plague of my life. I wake up in the morning, and the first thought that comes into my mind, if I don't fight it off, is, now, what was it I was worrying about before I fell asleep last night? This is the kind of anxiety, this kind of thing causes our lives to be miserable. It causes us to be unhappy. It causes loss of health. I heard a story, I believe Brother Guy in Woods told this story about a man, and this has been some years ago, who was a preacher of the gospel. And he was going to go and preach somewhere. He had an appointment somewhere, and it required him catching a ferry to get across a body of water. And he was so worried and anxious about getting there on time to catch that ferry before it started across that body of water, because he knew if he didn't catch the ferry, he wouldn't make it to his appointment on time. And so he got his wife and his children, and he got them all together, and they all worked, and they got him up, and they got him on his way. And when he got to the dock, his worst fears, there was the ferry out away from the dock. And so he just took off, and he took a flying leap and jumped over onto the ferry, and there was an old boy standing there, and he grabbed him and pulled him up on the ferry, and he said, "What in the world are you doing?" And he said, well, I've been worried about this all for a week now. I've got to catch this ferry. And he said, the ferry was coming into the dock, not going out. And that's just about how it is. That's just about how worthless anxiety really is. There are two things that we should never worry about. First of all, the things that we can help, we shouldn't worry about that. We just need to do what we need to do to fix it. And the things that we can't help. You know, people worry about getting old. Oh, I'm getting old. I do that sometimes. I can't do the things that I used to do. You know, there are weird things that are happening. I have I'm old. I'm getting old. And I wonder, if I'm this way now, what's it going to be like in 10 years? And, you know, there's one way not to worry about growing old. That's to die young. So, anxiety. Now think about it. This is a test for us all. Is demonstrative of little faith. All right, Matthew chapter 8, beginning with verse 23. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 23. And we're a little pressed for time, so I'm going to go ahead and read this. And when he got onto the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he, Jesus, was asleep. And they went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're perishing. And he said to them, Why are you afraid, O you of little faith? Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Fear of the future. fear of what we've got to look forward to, is an expression of little faith. Now, this is not the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom. That's not what I'm talking about. There are some things that we do need to fear, but this is the fear that grips at the heart and tears at the soul, erasing the desire that we have to go on with our lives. And we know people like this, and we may be people like that ourselves. We worry about nuclear war. He said it's just inevitable. We're all going to be destroyed by nuclear bombs. The healthcare system. You know, I catch myself worrying about that sometimes. What in the world is that going to amount to in another 5 years? How am I going to pay for this? What about Social Security? I've been paying into Social Security all my life. I'm not going to live long enough to draw a dime. Medicare, I don't even want to talk about that. But this is demonstrative of a lack of confidence in God. God does not want His people to be afraid of the future. Matthew chapter 14, beginning with verse 28. And here Peter is, once again, he's looking out and he sees a man walking on the water. And they think that it's Jesus. Some of them say, no, it's a spirit. But Peter cries out and said, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. That's a command. Come on. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out His hand and took hold of him, saying, Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Got on the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped Him, saying, Truly you are the Son of God. Now here we have plain and simple doubt of God's Word. A sign of little faith. I heard a story about a man who stretched a high wire. And he climbed up a ladder and he got on the high wire and he had by that time, a big audience. And he said, how many of you think I can walk across this high wire backwards? All one or two hands went up and he walked it backwards with ease. And then he said, now how many of you think I can walk it back forward again? Forward, this way. Oh, more people raised their hand that time. He walked it forward, of course, with ease. Then he had someone haul up a wheelbarrow. And he set the wheelbarrow out on the high wire and he said, how many of you think that I can walk backwards with this wheelbarrow across this wire? And once again, maybe 2 or 3 people raised their hands and he did it with ease. Now how many people think that I can do it forward? Oh, just about everybody raised their hand. And then they had total confidence in him. And of course, he walked it forward with ease. And he said, now, let's have a volunteer to come up and get in the wheelbarrow while I walk you across the wire. Not a hand went up. Not a hand. Well, that's sad. We believe in God and His wheelbarrow so we don't have to get in. It's a sign of little faith. There was once, years ago, there was a woman in a wagon pulled by horses, and the horses spooked and they ran off, and the woman was telling the story, and she said, I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to think. And the people said, well, why didn't you trust in the Lord? And she said, well, I did till the harness broke. But it's when the harness breaks that we need to have faith in God. Oh, you of little faith. In Matthew chapter 16, there's a story of Jesus where He says to His disciples, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, beginning in verse 5. They had forgotten to bring bread. Jesus says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. Well, you can see the wheels turning. And what does He mean by this? And one of them said, well, it's because we forgot to bring bread. Verse 8, but Jesus, aware of this, said, Oh, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets were gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets were gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, then I understood, of course, that He wasn't talking about physical, material bread. He was talking about the false teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. A worldly, materialistic attitude is demonstrative of little faith. I knew a man, I used to work with him, loved the man, good friend of mine. You bring up a conversation with him and it wasn't 30 seconds until we'd be talking about football or basketball or baseball. It didn't make any difference to him which sport, any sport. His mind was saturated with sports. Paul, in the Bible, used any and every situation in order to teach Jesus, to save souls. Mind saturated with the Word of God. I remember my daddy, back when my mother died, and I graduated from college, and we were home together there for a little while, and you could have one or two conversations with my daddy. You could talk about the orchard business, or you could talk about the Bible. That's about the extent of it. Mine was saturated with horticulture and Bible. There are people who are indifferent. They're not interested in spiritual matters. You know, I used to blame myself when I'd look out in a crowd of people and see somebody asleep. And by the way, I don't see anybody asleep tonight. But I have seen them asleep, and I used to blame myself for it. I'd think, well, man, I must be really boring. Well, I probably am, but back then it bothered me. It doesn't bother me anymore. Back then it bothered me, and I think this has got to be my fault, but I don't think that anymore. I don't think it anymore. With age comes callous, I suppose. Now, I'm not talking about legitimate fatigue. There are people who are tired. When we're tired, we need to sleep. I understand that. I'm talking about people who are indifferent. You can be preaching, and one person will be listening and totally spellbound, and literally the next person sitting next to them will be sound asleep. If you don't believe that, if you have the opportunity to get up and preach, tell a funny story. It can have something to do with your topic. Tell a funny story. I told one about some pigs one time. There was an old boy that just about threw about every sermon. I started telling the story about the pigs, and he kind of roused out of his sleep, and I kept building to the climax, and he was sitting up and smiling, and I gave the climax, the punchline of the story, and he had a good laugh, and he understood it perfectly, and it wasn't 1 minute. I started back preaching the gospel, and he was sound asleep again. You know, I don't believe I've ever dozed off counting my own $20 bills. That's what I've heard before. We're awake when we're. Now, there are a few examples of great faith that Jesus mentioned. Here's the one in Matthew chapter 8 about the centurion, the man who came and wanted his servant healed, and he said, Lord, all you need to do is speak the word, and my servant will be healed. And then there's a Syrophoenician woman who, in Matthew 15, who Jesus said, do you not know that, I've been sent to the house of Israel. And Jesus said, is it not right to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs or throw it to the dogs? And the woman said, yes, Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Let's share in the blessings that fall from the master's table. Now, there are three things that these three examples of great faith have in common. Number one, they respected authority. Number two, they knew that the Lord had the power to accomplish what they wanted. And number three, they allowed the Lord to set the conditions. Now, these are examples of total confidence, total commitment, and total submission. So how did you do on the test? What kind of faith do you have? I think all of us, I'm relatively sure, have our weaknesses. I think maybe we're a little bit more focused on what we need to work on. We all need work, but like I said at the beginning, this is a concept that must be mastered. We all have work to do, and it would be so great if all of us could say, speak, Lord, your servant hears. Command, and I will obey. There may be someone here tonight who needs to respond to the invitation. Perhaps you've been weak in your faith. You need to be strengthened. Perhaps you need the prayers of this congregation in that regard. Perhaps there's someone here tonight who's never responded to the gospel, and you need to do that tonight. And we'll be more than happy to accommodate you. If you have any questions, anything like that, any way that we can help you. If you need to respond, I ask that you come as together we stand and sing.